Welcome to this week's episode of Insights. During this week's show, we're going to cover two things. The first, which is the biggest news story of our country, our region, and in many ways the world, which is the start of the large-scale ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, of its Armenian population, who are leaving fearing genocide by the Aliyev regime. And then we're going to move on to discuss the noted visit by USAID head Samantha Powers and U.S. Undersecretary of State Yuri Kim to Armenia. Let's start with the Artsakh update and what we know what's going on there. Sunday, about midday Armenia time, we got the reports the first refugees fleeing genocide were starting to arrive in Armenia to Kornizor, passing the Lachin corridor. Most of the initial people that were coming were women and children, with very few men. That has changed since then. It's been this build-up over the last couple of days, and what we've reached as of this morning, the official numbers are about 60,000 people that have already been ethnically cleansed from Artsakh, which is nearly half the population. Depending on who's there, we'll know in the next couple of days what the actual population was. This was followed up by a horrendous explosion. The Aliyev regime had started delivering gas, essentially for people to use in their cars to leave and be ethnically cleansed and leave the country. And that led to this massive explosion that created this even a greater humanitarian disaster on top of the disaster that we had, in which from what we know, at least more than 100 people who were killed, probably more than that, and at least more than 200 people were injured, at a time in which, since healthcare system in Artsakh has broken down and ambulances don't have any gas, you had no way of actually transporting many people to the hospitals, and they needed to be walked by relatives in different ways, being taken to hospitals to be taken care of. The following morning, there was a medevac started with Russian and Armenian helicopters moving many of these people to get health care in Armenia. This was followed up by an interesting story, a side story that happened, is that the Aliyev regime has started executing in cold blood Russian peacekeepers, assassinating them. Apparently, in one of these cases, and they've killed 6 of them so far, and they were all shot in close range, is that they had managed to walk into what was scenes of mass murder. Either they tried to stop it, or that they were filming it. There's different kinds of stories. That led to interesting developments because the Russian state turned around and actually blamed Armenia for their murders, while not blaming Baku. And these are stories that are going to come out over the next few months. And yesterday, we had the unfortunate news of the arrest of former State Minister Ruben Vartanyan. And I suspect that they're going to start mass arresting people that were involved in the government in Artsakh. And I think this is, frankly, hostage taking. There's not particularly any legal grounds for doing so. But you're dealing with a criminalized regime. And I think these are just adding to their hostages with the POWs that they never returned, and a half a dozen different things that they're holding. It's just another card that's going to be used for future negotiations. Let's move on to analyzing this historic and tragic week. I'm not going to dwell too much on what needs to be done in the future in detail. That's another matter. Today isn't the day for it. Let's start off with the facts. We need to be completely honest with ourselves, no matter how harsh the truth is or where it takes us. The reality is this is the second darkest moment in modern Armenian history, and it is the second Armenian genocide. What must this lead to, and what it should lead to is that every assumption that we've ever had needs to be questioned. Every Armenian institution in Armenia and the diaspora has fundamentally failed. This goes from the current Armenian government, who bears great responsibility for this tragedy and its leadership, to the smallest organizations in the diaspora. What I will tell our young people, since my generation has failed you, our generation has failed you, you should challenge and question everything, including our gods. When it comes to Artsakh, in the past 30 years, from a very hard politics perspective, there were only 2 variables. The first variable was build a strong, prosperous Armenia that could defend Artsakh and Armenia at all costs, in all circumstances. And the second one was you make a deal demanding for far less than you would like and settle the matter. We did neither of those 2 things. And in reality, since number 2 was never an option, Baku was never going to accept any option that does not include the scenario now, which is complete ethnic cleansing of Armenians. Number 1 was the only option. The second Armenian genocide has many fathers, mothers, and best men. We all know their names. I don't need to go over the foreign ones. But we are the ones who made this possible. For 25 years, we had our state and our primary institutions, not just the state, run through the toes of whores, and for the past 5 years, in the hands of incompetence. Moving forward, we need to operate on the following 3 principles. The first one is this. Let's understand one thing and one thing clearly. We have no friends. In foreign policy, we have 2 variables: countries that are enemies and countries that are not enemies. Our fate, defense, future are only in our hands. We should trust no one, and we should betray all when it suits our interests. Second rule, after the second Armenian genocide, everyone must understand that when it comes to our self-defense and preservation, we reserve the right to use all means necessary to achieve this. We are not bound by your rules, conventions, norms, or your imaginary world order. Third and lastly, it's time for a self-interested, self-preserving, and self-governing Armenia with teeth that asks neither for permission nor for forgiveness, and more importantly, one that deems weakness as the greatest sin. Now we're going to move on to the second topic of the week, which is what I call the Samantha Yuri show in Armenia. And who are these people? Samantha Powers is the head of USAID, which is the primary aid mission of the United States. Why she's famous is that, and she's made her claim to fame is the fact that she has been fighting genocide all her life, and in fact been an advocate on recognizing the Armenian genocide and half of the different things, or actually stopping genocides when possible. And her cohort in this case is the little Kim Yuri, is a woman of We Will Not Tolerate Ethnic Cleansing in Artsakh fame, which actually started 5 days before the illegal invasion of Artsakh and the ethnic cleansing that we're seeing now. She actually went in front of a Senate committee and said the United States will not tolerate ethnic cleansing, which obviously is not true, and obviously she was lying that day.
The United States will not countenance any effort or action, short-term or long-term, to ethnically cleanse or commit other atrocities against the Armenian people of northern Nagorno-Karabakh. The current humanitarian situation is not acceptable. Humanitarian access through the Lachen corridor and other routes must be available. Now we will do everything possible to make that happen.
Supposedly the 2 of them are here to deliver a letter from President Biden. Apparently they don't know email has been invented. And they're going to go to the border to witness the outflow of people from Artsakh escaping genocide. And lastly, to announce $11.5 million in aid to help the refugees. By the way, there are restaurants in Yerevan that are worth more than that. In reality, they're actually not here because of the reasons that they've outlined. They're actually here for another reason, which has to do with U.S. messaging on the possible invasion of Sunni that's likely to come from Azerbaijan, Turkey, or whatever directions, or whoever else is pushing it, the Russian state. And I think they're here to plant the U.S. flag in opposition to that, which is a good thing, but it has nothing to do with the refugees. And for people who don't know, essentially over the last week, there's been a lot of talk, especially after Erdogan and started talking about the Zangezur corridor and other matters, about an impending invasion of Armenia at this time, invasion of Sunik. There's been things over the last 24, 48 hours that are contradictory to that, but we don't know. It's quite possible. So I suspect that their visit here has much more to do with U.S. messaging on that than about the refugees, which frankly they could care less about. Let's move on and play a little part of the press conference that Ms. Powers and little Kim held in Goris a couple of days ago.
Standing surrounded by people who fled their homes, are you ready to say that's what this is?
We need to ensure that the international community gets access into Nagorno-Karabakh. There are still tens of thousands of ethnic Armenians who are there living in very vulnerable conditions. And already you are seeing as well the gathering of testimonies from people who have fled violence, deprivation, and with the fear of living under the government of Azerbaijan. Our
Stay in Azerbaijan or go back to your country. You don't care. Stop the lies.
Our focus, again, right now, and I'm U.S. aid administrator, is meeting the humanitarian needs of individuals in really vulnerable circumstances and looking out for and securing access to individuals who are either unable to proceed on the corridor because it is blocked with traffic, or in some cases too scared to make the journey to where we are today.
What you notice is that she actually does not answer the ethnic cleansing question for all the obvious reasons, because if she describes it as ethnic cleansing, and ethnic cleansing is genocide, by law, the United States and other major powers have a responsibility to act to stop it. But however, she goes to describe a scenario of what she has seen and what she has heard, which is the textbook definition of ethnic cleansing. As some of you might remember, a couple of months ago, we actually had a very specific show about Miss Powers and made some predictions there, which unfortunately have all come true. I am sure that her and her agency will be all over Armenia helping people that are ethnically cleansed Arts of Artsakh, because I suspect that is her preference at this point. I can already imagine, I can see the scene of her looking really sad, holding the hand of a 5-year-old refugee girl, looking really sad in a refugee camp. The likely reality is that this visit was actually pre-scheduled in a way that as soon as the refugee flow started, which they expected at some point this was going to start, she was going to fly out here in a time and manner in which she shows up to see it, but for it to be too late to actually do something about it. She could have come at any time during the 8 months of the blockade, and she didn't. And she suddenly starts when the worst situation happens. And I think that was deliberate, and because their actual policy is not that they were for ethnic cleansing, they were just not willing to do anything to stop it. It was just not worth their political capital. And how do we notice? As early as January of this year, her own staff was sent here by her to actually start doing pre-planning for the mass exodus of refugees fleeing genocide that they knew was coming. And lastly, what she's here for, outside of the state interests, as far as Sunnis are concerned in Armenia and the United States, is actually to save her personal reputation, because she knows there's going to be lots of books, articles written about the Second Armenian Genocide, and given her history and role, she would actually be one of the centers of why there was inaction that actually allowed this genocide. And this is her way of being able to tell future authors, well, it's not true that I didn't do anything. And the worst days I was there, I was trying to help, I brought aid, and I was actually doing things behind the scenes, but I didn't succeed because other really bad people stopped me. That's the reality of this trip. The truth is the following. Both the EU and the United States are enablers and legal accomplices on the Second Armenian Genocide, which was carried out by Aliyev, Putin, and Erdogan. Everyone knows, everyone knew this was coming, and now they want to save their souls by giving us money they found on the floor someplace. We should tell them to keep the refugee guilt money, and if you're serious about helping us, send us weapons or sell us weapons. In conclusion, this is a note to our Western friends. Just understand one thing. There's not enough money that you can send us that will ever buy back your souls. Thank you for joining me this week's episode of Insights.
For the others to fire, and you sit back and watch while the deaf can get tired. while the young people's blood flows out